Hello and welcome. So in the previous video we wrote our first contract with just a simple function that returns welcome to Ethereum as a hard-coded string. In this video what we are going to do is we are going to write one more simple contract which has some amount of interaction with the user so that you can see these things in action. Okay, so on the left side in the file explorer, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new contract and let's call this as counter contract v1 dot solve. v1 for the version 1 because we'll have two versions of the contract, and we'll have two different names, v1 and v2. Counter, so it's basically a simple contract that simulates a counter. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. So enter, so I'm in there. Now what I'll do is, again as I mentioned earlier, so what I'm going to do is from the first contract I'll just copy these two lines of code and put it over here, and to have more working space I'll just collapse the the file explorer there. So we have here the 0.8.24 compiler, and now we are going to create the contract. So let's create the contract, and I'm going to call this as counter contract v1. See, the contract name need not be the same as the file name itself, just as you have in Java. Okay, it can be anything, but normally sticking to that rule of having the contract name and the file name as same is actually pretty convenient. Okay, right. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a variable that holds the current count value. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, so I want a counter. Okay, so count, it is int and it is okay like this. So when I do it like this, it says pass expected identifier but got int. So what you have to do is you have to define it like this. You have to say the variable name and its data type. Okay, that's it. So this is how you have to write it. So first the data type followed by the name of the variable. The variable that sits at the contract level, okay, this is what we call it as a state variable. Don't worry about this, we are going to have detailed discussion later on. Okay, this is just to demonstrate how you can simply write contracts. That's all there is to it. Okay, so next what we need to do is we need to initialize this contract. So just like you have constructors in C++ Java class, we have constructor here as well. So we can say, so in Solidity the constructor is written as constructor, and then into the constructor you pass in whatever count value you want. Okay, say for instance I can say int underscore count. So this is the parameter, so this will be the argument, and then here I'll set the count as underscore count. So whatever you pass in into this constructor, that will be used to initialize the count, so that will become the initial count value. Now in order to get the count value, so you can say get, so we can define a function get count, and since it's not going to change any variable state in the state of the contract, so this is public because we want to use it from the outside of the contract, and also this is pure because it does not change the state of the contract, and it also returns the value which happens to be an integer, so returns an int, and here we just say return count. Okay, but if you see here function declared as pure, but this expression potentially reads from the environment or state and thus requires view. So there is the difference. So this is not a pure function. okay, in a sense that it does access the variables. Accessing the variables means that there is a potential, there is for instance, it's possible that you might change it. So instead of pure, we just call this as view. So that's the difference. A pure function does not access anything from inside the contract, any of the state variables, but our get count actually accesses the state variable count, but even though it does not change. So a view function also does not change, but it accesses a state variable. That's the difference. Okay, so now that we have done this, so we will go and compile this. Okay, and we go to the deployment. When you go to the deployment, you can see you have the deploy here. So it requires an input. So you see there, that's the difference, because when you deploy the contract, the counter has to be initialized. So let's say we initialize it to 10 and then we deploy it. So the deployment is successful, as you can see here at the bottom. And now when we come down in here, you can see the counter contract version 1. Now here you have the get count. So if I call this, I get the value 10, which is what we initialized it with. Okay, now I also want some amount of interactivity wherein I will be able to set the count, okay, at some point in time. And so what I want to do is, okay, I'll have another function set count, which takes in an integer and sets that as the value. So this is also public function. Okay, but this is going to make change to the state, so therefore it cannot be pure or view. So we don't mention any of this. Is it going to return any value? No, it does not return any value. It simply sets the value, that's all. So there is no return associated with this. And then here we can say count is signed underscore, or let's call this as new count and underscore new count. Okay, sorry, typo. Okay, also says function state mutability can be restricted to view. Okay, this is something that you have to keep in mind. Source part here and spans across multiple lines. So okay, so I'll just save this. Now you see I have this error, function state mutability can be restricted to view, so but we don't want that. Okay, so we'll keep it as is. Now if we try to go and compile, you'll see function state mutability can be restricted to view. Okay, relevant source part starts here and spans across the multiple lines. So let's see how to fix this error. Okay, so the error basically is that actually there's a typo in here, right? So instead of a minus, there should be a equal to here. So this is done. Now we can compile the code. The compilation is successful. We are not getting any errors. We come back here and we deploy this. So we have to deploy it all over again. So I'll just deploy this, and it says error encoding arguments invalid big number int, because we did not give the initial count. So let's say we put this as 10 and then deploy it, and now the deployment is successful. So this way it shows you that if your constructor is taking an argument, obviously when you deploy this, the value has to be given. So now that we have done it, so if I click on say, okay, so this is the older one, so the newer one is here. Okay, so you have set count and get count. So first let's see the get count, because we initialized with 10, so get count gives us 10, so that is fine. In the set count, I'll set it to 25 and click on set count. Okay, so this is successful here, and now if I do a get count, I get 25. So my code is running just fine. Now since this is a counter, I want to be able to increment and decrement, right? So I'll write functions for those as well. So to do that, I'll have function increment, which doesn't take any argument, just increments it by 1, and this function is also publicly visible, public, and because it is going to affect the state of the contract, so it's neither pure nor view. And does it return anything? Okay, it does not, so we'll just keep the returns as is, so we don't need to give any return. And in here we'll say count is assigned count plus 1. Similarly, we'll have another function called decrement, and this is also public. Here the count is decremented, count is assigned count minus. You could use the increment decrement operators as well. I'm just trying to keep it, simple there. Now we go back to our compile and let's compile the code, and I'm not seeing any errors, so this is just fine. We come to the deploy, and because I have got multiple versions of this contract, so what I will do is I'll just delete all the contracts in here, so this is empty now. Okay, now before deploying I need this input to initialize the counter. So let's say we initialize the counter by, let's say, 0, and click on deploy. So our contract is deployed. So if I open it up, now I can see all these functions in here. Set count takes in an input, decrement and increment don't take any inputs, they just increment and decrement by 1 respectively. So if I click on get count, I initialize it with 0, so I'm getting it 0. So let me set the count to, let's say 55, and set the count. This is successful. Get the count, I get 55. Let's say I increment, I've done it increment twice. Now if I give get count, so I see 57, and I click on decrement and I get the count, I get 56. Everything is working just fine. So this is our simple contract that takes an input from the user. But let's take it a little further. So what I'm going to do now is that I'll just copy all of this code, and I'll go to the file explorer and create a new file, and I'll call this as counter contract version 2 dot sum, and I'll just paste all the code. Okay, so this is exactly the same as we had last time, but now this time I want not just increment and decrement, but I also want that, okay, increment decrement are incrementing and decrementing by 1 each, that's it, right? So I want to take it a little further. I want to be able to give them, okay, increment by this much amount, decrement by this much amount, and so on. So in order to do that, I'll introduce 2 more functions in this case. So I'll say function increment by, and then I'll say int how much you want to increase. Okay, how much, just to make it more readable. Okay, this function is also public. It's not a view function because it is going to make changes to the state of the count variable. Okay, and it doesn't return anything, so no returns clause there. And here I'll say count. Now I am going to use plus equal to, which is the compound assignment operator. I'll say how much. Similarly for the decrement by, and how much, and this is also public. I'll say count minus equal to how much. That's it. So both these functions are introduced. So this is our version 2 of our contract. So now we need to compile this as well. So I'll just compile it. I don't see any errors, so that's good. Let's go to the deployment, and I'll just delete the version 1 here. So delete that, and also I need to change the name. So this is contract v2, and I'll compile it again. Yeah, so contract v2, and I'll initialize it with 0 to start with, and I'll deploy this. Deployment successful. Now you can see increment by, decrement by, and it also these two also taken inputs. So if I get the count, I should get 0 because it was initialized with 0. So let's say we set the counter. So let's set the counter to say 10, and click on set count. And now if I get the count, I get 10, right? Okay. So if I increment and I get the count, I get 11. If I decrement and I get the count, I get 10 again. So this is working just fine. So increment by, decrement by. So right now the count value is 10. I want to increase it by 5. So I'll say increment by 5. So I'll just give 5 and click on increment by, which means that it should, or my count should become 15, right? So get count, it gives me 15. And similarly for decrement by, let's say I want to decrement by 2. So right now the counter value is 15. Minus 2, it should give me 13. So I'll just decrement by and then get the count, and you see I get 13. That's it. This is how simple it is to write function that takes in inputs from the user and then interacts, and you are able to interact with the contract right now. Okay, that's it guys. So from next video onwards, we will start getting into the details of the language and learn each and every feature one by one, and have an associated demo with that, which will make your understanding very easy. If you have any issues or questions, you can put down in the comments. Okay, please don't forget to subscribe and also click the bell icon to get the notifications whenever I put up a new video. Thank you guys. Bye bye.